Hello everyone and welcome to this month's ITA webinar. It's a good afternoon from me here in Switzerland and a good morning, good afternoon or even good evening to all of you tuning in from all over the world. And I can already see you all saying hi in the chat. I just jotted down a few countries while the video was playing there. So hi to those of you joining us from Pakistan, Brunei, Brazil, Paraguay, Malaysia, Italy and Russia. My name is Mary Irvin and I am the Education Officer at the International Testing Agency. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Our topic today is the Prohibited List and Therapeutic Use Exemptions. We will look at what these are and what the main changes are for next year, and more about those in just a moment. But before we get into this, let me start with some important information. Firstly, we are very pleased to be able to bring you these webinars in 4 languages in addition to English. So if you would prefer to listen in Arabic, French, Spanish, or Russian, you can select one of these languages by clicking on the interpretation button on your Zoom menu. And on your screens now is a picture of how you can navigate to this. Some other housekeeping points, and most of you already know this, but please do say hi to us in the chat function. Tell us your role, sport, or where you are from. I'll say hi to a few more people now. We have hi to Romania, hi from Sri Lanka, and good morning to you as well in the Oregon coast, Czech Republic, Denmark, Ethiopia. Welcome everyone. Now, in addition to the chat, we also have the Q&A function available. So at any time, you can pop a question in here for our experts, and they will answer their questions at the end of the session. And finally, please note that we record all these sessions and we make them available on our YouTube channel. So back to our welcome. Firstly, thank you to those of you who tune in every month, and a big welcome to those of you participating for the first time. And a special welcome to all of the medical community who I know who have registered in large numbers alongside athletes and coaches. Now, before we move on, I would like to mention that the ITA is proud to be recognised by UNESCO as a leading international organisation for the delivery of anti-doping programmes. And this education webinar is delivered with the support of the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport. Now, today's webinar is the 11th of a year-long monthly series that are publicly available and designed to tackle key anti-doping topics and to raise clean sport awareness. And to put today's session into context, each month we pick one key anti-doping topic, whether it's related to doping control, the legal process, or supplements, and we discuss this in some detail with experts and athlete guests. And as always, it's my pleasure to introduce our official presenting partner for this webinar programme, Informed Sport. Informed Sport is a global certification programme for supplements that batch test products for substances prohibited in sport. As supplement contamination continues to be one of the leading causes of inadvertent doping, we are happy to partner up with Informed Sport for this educational project. And you can check out their website and look up certified products at sport.wetestoutrust.com. So on to today's topic, an extremely important one. All athletes and their coaches and their support personnel should not only be aware of the prohibited list, but also know what it is, how to use it, how to explain it to their doctors, and how to check their medications. In parallel, it's really important to be aware that there could be times when you need to use a medication that it is prohibited in sport. And in these situations, you need to know what to do to get authorization for this. And this is where therapeutic use exemptions come in, or TUEs for short. and you will hear these be mentioned many times over the course of the next hour or so. And alongside this, it is important to know that the list of substances that appear on the prohibited list is looked at by a team of experts every year, and modifications are made. This means you have to be sure that you are looking at the list for the correct year. And this is particularly the case for 2022, as there are a number of changes that will come into force on the 1st of January, particularly to a substance called glucocorticoids. And we will go through all of these points in some detail today. So firstly, I'd like to gauge your understanding of the 2022 prohibited list. And we're going to do this by using a quick poll question. So already on your screens, you can see a question appear. And the question is, do you know what the changes to the 2022 prohibited list are? So you can either choose yes, no, or even I don't know what the prohibited list is. So this poll is anonymous, and that's great. I can see a lot of you voting already. And this is really just for us to gauge how much information you're already aware of prior to today's session. So great, I can already see that we're up at more than 60% of you participating. I can see that only 2% of you don't know what the prohibited list is. Don't worry, we're going to talk about that in just a few moments. And that a lot of you already know what some of the changes are. We hope that by listening to this session, you're going to learn even more. And for those of you who don't know, we're also going to explain the major modifications too. Okay, so let's take a look at our second poll question now. And that is, have you ever completed a therapeutic use exemption form? Okay, and again, it's a single answer and it is anonymous. And you can answer yes, no, or maybe you don't know what one is. That's also okay. We're going to explain that to you today. Okay, so the answers are coming through quickly this month. This is great to see. Yeah, we're already up at nearly 70% of you answering. So thank you for that. Okay, so I can see the majority of you have not completed a TUE form, but about a third of you have. So again, we're going to take you through the details should you ever need to apply for one. Okay, so just in summary there, for those of you who are familiar with today's topics and perhaps already work in this field, we hope that you still find this session valuable. And if you have any questions for our experts, we look forward to addressing them towards the end of the session. But like all of our monthly webinars, our content is designed and prepared for athletes and athlete support personnel. So this seems like a very appropriate point to introduce our expert panelists today who are going to take us through all of this. Firstly, we have Mark Stewart, a sports pharmacist and ITA operations development manager. So Mark has a wealth of experience in the area of drugs in sport and has led the pharmacy operations at over 16 Olympic, Paralympic, Commonwealth and European Games, including being the head of pharmacy for the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Mark is also currently the director of the IOC Drugs and Sport Programme and advises the International Olympic Committee on the delivery of pharmacy services for the Olympic Games. Most recently, Mark was an author of the latest research paper on glucocorticoids in sport, which has led to some of the new changes being implemented by WADA for this class of drugs in 2022. Hi, Mark. It's great to have you joining us today. Next, I would like to introduce Davey Healy, WADA's medical manager. Now, Davey has been working at WADA for over 3 years. And prior to this, he worked as a sports pharmacist at a number of international events, including the Rio 2016 Olympic Games, the 2017 Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games in Ashgabat, and the 2019 World Indoor Athletics Championships. Welcome, Davey. We're looking forward to hearing from you a bit later on, and good morning to you in Canada.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening even.
Thanks for being here with us early your time. And thirdly, our athlete guest this month is former Australian rules footballer with the West Coast Eagles, Eric Mckenzie. Now, Eric has an MSc in Strength and Conditioning, and it has a Master of Advanced Studies in Sport Administration. Now, as an athlete, Eric had a lot of experience applying for therapeutic use exemptions and receiving cortisone injections. And he is going to share his experiences with us very soon. For now, though, I would like to say a good evening and welcome to Eric in Australia.
Thank you, Marie. Good to meet you all.
Thanks for joining us. So we have someone in the morning, someone in the afternoon, and someone in the evening. We really are reaching all corners of the globe today. So very quickly to recap, this is what we're going to cover today. First up, Mark will take us through the prohibited list and outline the main changes for 2022. Then Davey will present therapeutic use exemptions, and we'll particularly look at what this means in light of the new rules around glucocorticoids. Eric will then share his personal experiences and give some advice to the athletes and coaches tuning in. And then at the end, we'll take your live questions. And just a reminder, the Q&A box is open already now, so don't hesitate to send your questions our way. So let's now hear directly from Mark as he presents our first topic of the day, the prohibited list. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here and to see so many people from around the world on this meeting today. Today, I'm going to give an overview of the list of prohibited substances and methods, and especially some of the new changes that will come into effect on the 1st of January next year. So the list of prohibited substances and methods, I'm going to call it the list, is the international standard which is published by the World Anti-Doping Agency that defines which substances and methods are banned in sport. Now, the most important thing to remember is that the list exists and where to find it. But as an athlete or athlete support personnel, it is also very important that you are familiar with what's on the list and that you know how to check whether the medication you plan to take or prescribe to athletes is prohibited or permitted in the sports that they compete in. The list is a constantly evolving document and updated at least annually. And as an athlete or person working with athletes, it's really important you always check for any updates. Now, WADA publishes the version for the upcoming year by the 1st of October generally, and this comes into effect on the 1st of January. But occasionally, changes are made middle of the year. So if you need to take a new decision about whether to take a medicine, always refer to the WADA website for the current list. So you're basing that decision on the current rules. So how does the substance get onto the list rather? A new substance or method can be added to the prohibited list if it is deemed to meet two of the following three criteria. So firstly, that it has the potential to enhance sport performance. For example, that the substance can make an athlete run or swim or compete faster or for longer, or lift heavier weights, or feel less pain so they can push themselves just a little bit harder. The second criteria is that the substance or method represents a health risk to the athlete. Now, many of the drugs on the list fall into this category based on some of the serious side effects they have and the negative impact on health. For example, anabolic steroids can have serious cardiac side effects, which can result in an increased risk of heart attack in the worst case scenarios. And some of the narcotic drugs, for example, heroin or fentanyl, have a serious risk of addiction. And marijuana use, we know that has widely documented health risks for users. Now, the last criteria is that the use of the substance or method violates the spirit of sport. Now, the spirit of sport really covers many concepts, but in essence, it really is the values relating to ethics or fair play and honesty, respect for the rules, the laws, and respect for other athletes and teammates. So I always explain this in terms of, if something is being used with the intention to cheat, then it's probably going to be against the spirit of sport. This is an overview of all the sections of the prohibited list. On the left, it has all the substances and methods prohibited at all times. That is every day of an athlete's life, including when they're not competing. I'm going to go through this list. It includes, firstly, anabolic agents, and this includes things like testosterone or clenbuterol, and these are used to increase muscle mass and strength. Now, these might be advantageous in sports such as weightlifting or other sports involving strength. The next category is peptide hormones and growth factors. Examples might be EPO or erythropoietin and growth hormone. Now, some of these are used for genuine medical conditions, but they might be abused in sport to improve endurance or even strength. The next category is Beta2 agonists. Now, this contains many common asthma medications, and athletes, particularly with asthma, must be aware of these. Sometimes a TUE is needed for drugs in this category. The next group is hormone and metabolic modulators, and this includes things like insulin or meldonium. And athletes with diabetes may actually need insulin on a daily basis, so may need a TUE for these drugs. And meldonium is also an example of a medicine in this section, which is available over the counter in some countries. Diuretics and masking agents. So an example is furosemide. Now, these are used medically for the treatment of cardiovascular conditions. The bottom section on the left there is prohibited methods, and these include things like blood transfusions or intravenous infusions in certain situations. The next section on the right are those drugs prohibited only during the in-competition time, and this is from midnight before the event until the end of the doping control process. Now, these include stimulants, for example, ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. Now, this is a particular category that catches athletes out, as many of these are found in over-the-counter medicines for coughs and colds and runny nose, for example. There's another category there called narcotics. And this includes things like morphine and other very strong pain relievers. And athletes may actually need these after a serious injury in an emergency setting. And if they're used, a retroactive TUE would probably need to be applied for. David will cover this a little bit later on. There's a group called cannabinoids, and this includes cannabis, marijuana, hashish, and we know there's some health risk associated with their use. And the last section there is glucocorticoids. Now, by certain routes of administration, such as injection. Now, glucocorticoids are used for the treatment of sports injuries, such as inflammation of joints. And this is the category with the most significant changes for 2022. I'll talk about that in depth a little bit later on. The list of substances is harmonized across all sports, but there's one section where sport-specific rules apply. If I could just go to the next slide, please. This is the section that talks about beta blockers. This category of drugs can act to reduce tremor and may be advantageous in sports that require a steady hand. And so for this reason, they're banned in the sports that you can see on the screen, including sports such as archery and golf, among others. I just want to quickly mention the terms specified and non-specified. which you'll see on the list, and they're applied to various sections within the list. So basically, these terms are legal terms, and they're used to determine the length of sanction that an athlete might receive if they test positive. Now, some substances on the list could have a longer sanction than others. But in any case, whether they fall into either one of these categories, the message for athletes is still the same. They're still prohibited. In very brief summary before we move on, I just wanted to reiterate some of the key points regarding the list. So there's many common medications on the list and which are banned, including some on the screen: antihypertensives for blood pressure, insulin for diabetes, ADHD medication, and diuretics. But if these are needed for legitimate medical conditions, athletes can apply for an exemption to be able to take them. Again, David will cover this. A key thing to remember is that if you're taking any medicines or might be prescribed a new medicine in the future, always remind your doctor or pharmacist that you're an athlete and you're subject to anti-doping rules so they can help you check the status. Also, the key responsibility is with the athlete. The athlete is responsible for any prohibited substance they take or attempt to take or is even found in their system. If an athlete tests positive for a banned substance, it will be on them to prove their innocence. So the rules are really clear and the consequences are really tough and potentially career-changing. So athletes really need to take this seriously. These are some of my top tips when accessing and reading the prohibited list. So firstly, not everything on the prohibited list is a medicine. It also contains substances found in plants, veterinary drugs, drugs that are still in clinical development, and chemicals that are not meant ever for human use. Secondly, not every prohibited medicine is listed on the prohibited list. Now, many sections just provide a few common examples, but there may be many more. An example of that is the Beta2 Agonist category. Now, on the prohibited list lists many of the common asthma drugs, but this list is certainly not exhaustive. Thirdly, only the ingredient names are listed, not the brand names. So when you're looking up something like Ventolin, which is used for asthma, you won't find the Ventolin name on the list. But if you look up the ingredient, which is salbutamol, this is listed. So this is just another reason why you should always ask your doctor or your pharmacist to help you work out what is in your medicine, because the ingredient is often in very fine print on the box. Lastly, many natural products are not specifically listed. You won't find things like herbs or animal-based products, but some of the ingredients within them might be there. Now, for example, there's a herb, ephedra, which is used in Chinese medicine. Now, this actually contains ephedrine, which is on the list, but you won't find the name of that herb on the prohibited list. So I have to say, sometimes it's really difficult document for athletes to use, and I would always recommend getting professional guidance to make sure you get it right. A few other things to mention when checking your drugs. The way a medicine is given will affect its status. Now, the way it's given is called the route of administration. And as an example, for glucocorticoids, when they're used topically on the skin, say for an itchy rash, or in the nose for allergies, this is actually permitted. But when that same drug is taken by the mouth in a tablet form or injected or used rectally, this is prohibited. There's also some drugs that are only prohibited in males. This includes some of the hormone medications that are used medically. And there's some medicines that are only prohibited at very high doses, but may be permitted at lower normal doses. And this includes some of the asthma medications. Again, there's so much that an athlete needs to know when trying to navigate this list. So I know you'll be pleased to hear that there are a lot of resources out there to help you. One of the best resources, I think, is globaldro.com. Now, if you live in Canada, the UK, USA, Switzerland, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, you can search for the brand name of the medicines in your countries. But Global Draw is not just for those countries. Any country, any athlete in any country can look at the status of an ingredient or find links to some of the other international websites with information specific to your country. There's a good index and a list of international resources there that you may be able to find something that is specific to your country. So I'd really encourage all athletes to check this out if you haven't already. Secondly, ask your doctor or your pharmacist. They are experts in medicines and they can help you interpret the WADA list. Now, many national anti-doping agencies also have athlete advice lines with experts to help with your questions about medicines in your country. Okay, so let's talk about what's in store for next year. This is less than 2 months away. There's a few substances that athletes need to be aware of from January 2022 that are either new to the list or have been modified on the list. And I'm going to go through these new additions one by one. Firstly, Tibolone. This is a drug used for menopausal treatment and endometriosis. Now, this has actually been on the list for some time, but it's been moved into a new section. It has anabolic properties, and that's why it is banned. Oxalodrastat is a new example of a drug used for the treatment of Cushing's disease. Now, this also has anabolic properties, and that's why it's banned. BPC-157. Now, this is known as body protecting compound. Now, you won't see this available as a legitimate medicine at the pharmacy or in the hospital, but because it is not approved for human medical use is why this has been added as an example. And this is the first time an example of a non-approved substance has actually been added to the list. The first ones here on this next slides, I'm going to try to pronounce these. Lonapeg-somatropin, somapacitan, and somatrogon. These are all types of growth hormones, and these are used for the treatment of certain medical conditions. And they've been added as examples of types of growth hormones in that section. Next, we've got fluoromethylphenidate and ethylphenidate and methyl naphthodate. These are 3 new stimulants which have been added. Now, it's very unlikely that you will see these in medicines, but they relate to an existing drug on the list called methylphenidate, or better known as Ritalin, and that's been on the list for some time. The last one there on the slide is hydraphenol. Now, this can be found in supplements, and it's marketed to promote awakeness and alertness. The reason why this is added is that it's similar to modafinil, which has been on the list for some time as well. So this is another reason to always really carefully check what's in your supplements. This is a new one that has just gone on. There's been a small change to the Beta2 agonist category, and this is really important to know if you have asthma and you use salbutamol puffers. So you can see there, many of the common asthma medications on the prohibited list have maximum daily doses that are permitted and which don't need a TUE. For salbutamol, the last one on that list, the maximum daily dose is 1,600 micrograms. Now that will remain unchanged. But previously, up until the end of this year, you could not exceed 800 micrograms over 12 hours. Now that's 8 puffs of a normal, salbutamol puffer before you would need a TUE. From January, it must not exceed 600 micrograms over 8 hours. Now that's 6 puffs over 8 hours before needing a TUE. This is still a pretty high dose that is needed to exceed the permitted dose each day. But sometimes these high doses are needed if you have an asthma episode. And if you do need doses higher than this, which does happen in some athletes, you can ask your doctor to help you submit a TUE. David will cover this later. I'd like to spend some time particularly on the changes to glucocorticoids for 2022. One of the most significant changes for the 2022 list is the addition of local injections of glucocorticoids as a prohibited route during the in-competition period. Now, the reason why this change needs special attention by both athletes and healthcare providers is that local injections of glucocorticoids are widely used in sports medicine for athletes. They're mainly used to treat common musculoskeletal injuries, where they can provide fast and pretty effective pain relief and improvement of joint function and motion. Now, local injections include injections given into and around the joint area, and these are often referred to as intra-articular. There's some other examples of what they're called there on the screen. But local injections also apply to those given into the skin or underneath the skin. And sometimes these are called subcutaneous or intradermal injections. This change from January means that a TUE may be needed when glucocorticoids are used in this way for the treatment of athletes. Other existing prohibited routes for glucocorticoids remain unchanged, and they include oral or intravenous, intramuscular, and rectal routes. These have been prohibited for over 20 years now, and nothing will change with those. The main reason why local injections have been added to the prohibited list is that there is now new data available to show that local injections, firstly, can reach levels in the body similar to those of existing prohibited routes, such as intramuscular or intravenous. And until now, it has been almost impossible to distinguish between permitted and prohibited routes of glucocorticoids based just on laboratory results. Secondly, and more importantly, local injections of glucocorticoids can actually reach levels that are consistent with doses that have been shown to have the potential to improve performance. So overall, the effect of glucocorticoids following local injections may therefore present a significant potential to improve performance and possibly cause harm to health. So this new rule really ensures that athletes are always competing on a level playing field at all times. I want to briefly note another important change being introduced, which will improve how laboratories report the results. Now, this is all very technical information that really only needs to be considered by the laboratories next year, but it's worth a mention to show how the science of testing is improving to protect the clean athlete. Previously, the same 30 nanograms per ml urinary reporting level was used for all glucocorticoids. But with new data available, these have been tailored to match the varied properties of each individual type of glucocorticoid. So the good news for athletes is that this will enable the laboratories to be much more accurate in detecting actual doping and to ultimately protect the clean athlete. The other important new information to consider is this new guidance on washout periods. Now, a washout period it's the duration of time required for the drug in the body to fall to a level that would not be reported as a positive test. Now, these new washout periods will really help doctors base decisions on the best selection and use of glucocorticoids for athletes, and also to ensure that athletes avoid any positive tests after their use. This table shows the washout periods for various glucocorticoids and their routes, many of which are commonly used in the sports medicine setting. Not only have the injectable routes been provided, but also very helpful new guidance for oral routes as well. These washout periods you'll see vary from 3 days up to 60 days, depending on the type of drug and the way that they're administered. David, a little bit later, will cover how these new washout periods should be taken into account now when deciding whether to apply for TUE. So just a few key points to summarize the changes for glucocorticoids. All glucocorticoids are prohibited in competition when administered by any injection taken orally or by a rectal route from 1st of January. If they're injected or taken during the washout period prior to competition, there is a chance that your test could be positive. So it's important to make sure your doctor knows that you're an athlete, that they take good medical notes. So if you do test positive, you can justify the use of this medication in the event of a positive test. And David will give you more information on this. Lastly, I know there's many healthcare professionals and scientists in the audience today who may be interested in more detail and the scientific reasons for these changes to glucocorticoids. The full approach to these changes, with references to all of the studies that have been used to inform these decisions, has been published in the July edition of the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and we'll provide you with a link to this after the presentation. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Happy to take any questions later on. And I'll hand back to Mari. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. First up, I think I'd like to say that if there was going to be a gold medal for pronouncing complicated substance names, that you would get it. I'm just hoping to get through the next hour saying glucocorticoids correctly. I'm glad I wasn't reading some of those slides.
I did practice those names for about 10 minutes before before this.
Well,
they're pretty tricky.
Well done. And I think you said before that when these are translated, the names are the same. So I'm hoping that our simultaneous translators have been able to get their tongues around those as well. Okay. So anyway, before we hear from Davey, I'd like to do a little medications activity. So Mark, if you stay with us for a few minutes, and I'd like to welcome back Eric for these next few slides. So we're going to put some images of medications on your screen now, and we'd like to ask Eric if he thinks they are prohibited in sport, i.e. if they appear on the prohibited list. Now, Eric, you are a retired athlete, so this doesn't apply to you now, but it's good for our listeners to understand the process that an athlete should go through when checking their medications. So we're going to put the first one up on screen now, and maybe we could start, Mark, with a little bit of background to this one.
All right, Eric, here we go. So this drug on the screen, it's called triamcinolone. It's an injection, and it's commonly used for sports injuries, particularly with inflammation. Now, how this is used, it's injected into the joint, usually by the intra-articular route. So I know you've had some experience with cortisone injections, Eric. What do you think is going to happen with this particular one?
Well, I think going on the new list, that in 2022, this is now going to be no longer allowed in competition. So that's going to be my guess. I think previously, well, you can use it so long as you have a TUE in place. Would be the way I go with it. I think previously you might have been able to use it, but that's all changed recently.
Spot on.
It will change.
Spot on, Eric. Well done. You know, just the other thing to mention there is the washout period, which we now know for this particular drug. The washout period for triamcinolone after a local injection into the joint is 10 days. It takes 10 days for it to get out of your system. Interestingly, if this drug is injected into the muscle, it stays in your body for about 60 days. This drug stays around for a long time. If you're tested during a washout period, you may actually come back positive. Those TUEs are important, particularly for this one, especially from January.
60 days is a long time to think about when your competitions are. So yeah, you have to be all over it.
Absolutely. All right, Eric, listen, this next one, this is called a Subutamal Inhaler. And this is really commonly used for asthma, to treat the symptoms of an asthma attack. What do you reckon is going to happen with this?
Similar to the last one, I think it's slightly changed with the new list in place. So the level has come down. So you still are allowed up to a certain amount, but after that, then you're going to you'll get a anti-doping violation if you test positive over a certain level. Would be my guess for this one.
Spot on.
I've been listening properly.
You have been listening. Well done. Yes, you know, at normal doses, at very sort of many of the normal doses that are recommended by the manufacturer, they will remain as permitted. But once you get up into very high doses, then you may need a TUE. And it's changed from, just to remind everyone, 8 puffs over 12 hours you couldn't exceed it. From January, it's going to be, you can't exceed 6 puffs over 8 hours. The total, maximum daily dose of 1600 micrograms still applies, and that's about 16 puffs a day. 16 puffs a day is the maximum over 24 hours. Great.
In the heat of competition, it's going to be hard to remember how many puffs you've had, so you're better off being safe with that and having the TUE. Exactly.
All right, one last one, Eric. What do you make of this one here on the screen?
As soon as we talk about supplements, I always get very, very cautious in and around that. So my personal opinion would be to leave it, but this was another one which has been added to the list. I was paying attention in this one. The hydrophenyl is definitely a new one. It's very similar to one of the other ones which was on the list previously. So yeah, I would be steering clear of this one again.
Exactly. Yes, hydrophenyl, new on the list. Sold as supplements. If you're taking this, you need to, stop taking it before January, basically. So this is certainly one to watch for athletes. This is in a lot of over-the-counter supplements you can purchase. Great. Thanks, Eric. Well done. 3 out of 3.
Better than last time I was on. So I'm improving.
That's what we hope for all the time. Yeah, but thank you both for that little exercise. And I think this really demonstrates the importance of keeping up with the prohibited list. Now we're going to switch topics now, but we'll see both of you a little bit later on. So thank you for now. Okay, so we saw there some of the medications that were newly banned or had dosing limits coming into effect in 2022. But what if an athlete legitimately needs to use a prohibited substance? So let's welcome back Davey, who's going to explain a little bit more about this. Thanks, Davey, and over to you.
Thanks, Mary. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about the therapeutic use exemptions, or as I'm going to be calling them throughout the talk, TUEs. So what is a TUE? As Mark has explained, the list contains all the substances prohibited in sport. But what happens if you, as an athlete, need to use one of those substances to treat a medical condition? This is why the TUE system was created. The TUE application process provides athletes with an opportunity to apply for a TUE, and if granted, the authorization to use the prohibited treatment while competing in sport. So this process, protecting all clean athletes, promotes competition on a level playing field and also upholds the fundamental principle of fair sport, which is inclusion. So how do you know if you need a TUE? What are the first steps to do? Say you're taking a medication, you're worried, what if this is prohibited? So the first thing to do, start with yourself, do an online search, check the WADA website, check the prohibited list. If you're still kind of unsure, if there's a lot of good drug databases out there, for example, I think Mark has already mentioned Globodro, which is a very useful tool. And of course, then secondly, you can always speak with a knowledgeable sports doctor. Often your local doctors, maybe they don't have that kind of knowledge about sport. So here I would advise you to contact your national anti-doping organization. You can go on your website, find their details, drop them an email or give them a call. So once you confirm if the medication is banned, you can then begin the process of applying for a TUE. So now you know the substance is prohibited, but which organization should you apply to? Where do you start? So TUEs are granted by anti-doping organizations. So these include international federations. So federations for different sports. For example, FIFA would be the international governing body for soccer, for football, UCI for cycling. Secondly, we have national anti-doping organizations, or NADOs as they're known for short. This is your country's anti-doping body. For example, in Ireland, we have Sport Ireland. In the US, it is USADA. In the UK, UCAD. And finally, we have major event organizers. These are one-time kind of big events, for example, the Olympics, the Pan Am Games. So thus these kind of organizations should be your first port of call if you have any queries about the process. If you're unsure of what kind of level you fit into, which one of them you should apply to, your first stop should be your national anti-doping organization. They should then be able to provide you with some good advice and guidance of apply to us or apply to the International Federation. Okay, so we're going to start here with a little poll question as we go through, just to get the kind of creative juices going, get you thinking. So which type of anti-doping organizations process the most TUEs per year? Is it the NADOs, the National Anti-Doping Organizations, the IFs, the International Federations, the major event organizers, or the ITA, the International Testing Agency? Okay, so I'll give a few seconds for you to vote. Okay, so the votes are coming in there, and I'm actually surprised that there's the majority have, so we'll close the voting. So the majority of you haven't got this right. It is the National Anti-Doping Organizations. Just over half of you have voted for them. So previously it would have been the international federations, but as the years have gone on, their national federations, because they have a bigger pool of athletes as well, we are seeing a lot more NADO TUEs. Okay, and we have another question. So around how many TUEs are granted every year? This is on a global basis. So how many TUEs do you think have been approved every year? Is it 100, 500, 3,000, or 10,000? Again, I'll give you a few seconds to get your answers in. This should give you a kind of an idea of how prevalent TUEs are. Remember, there's millions of athletes out there. Okay, so again, everyone seems to be very clued in today, and we have the majority with just over 50% choosing the correct answer of 3,000. So that's general figure we have every year. It's not exact, and obviously figures have fluctuated due to COVID and the less competitions, but that is kind of around the figure we'd see every year. So moving on and continuing with the presentation. How to apply for a TUE. So where do you start? The first thing to do is download the TUE application form from your anti-doping organization website, or fill it in online if they have that option. Remember, it is your responsibility as an athlete to provide a completed TUE application containing adequate medical information to confirm the diagnosis of your medical condition. So how do you make sure that you do this? With the help of your doctor. And I would strongly recommend that you bring the TUE application form and the relevant TUE checklist, which are available on the WADA website, with you when you go to see your doctor. It's important as well, if you are going to see a local doctor who maybe isn't involved in sport, inform them that you are an athlete and you are subject to anti-doping rules. Okay, so here on this slide, I have the life cycle of the TUE application process. So here we'll go through the whole TUE process. Everything will start with you, the athlete, and your physician. Perhaps you visit your doctor and you get diagnosed with a medical condition. Maybe it's first time you had it. For example, you get diagnosed with irritable bowel disease, and that requires a treatment with glucocorticoids. Or perhaps you were diagnosed with diabetes from an early age of 7 years old, but you have just qualified to compete in a national or international event, thus bringing you under anti-doping rules, and then subject to testing. In either of these scenarios, you should apply for a TUE as soon as possible. And as described in the previous slide, prepare your application with the help of your doctor. Once your application is complete, you submit it to your anti-doping organization. This anti-doping organization will usually have a TUE manager or a TUE administrator who will review the application to make sure that you have all the correct information in place. And then they will then pass it on to what is called a Therapeutic Use Exemption Committee, or a TUEC. So that's what I'll be calling them here now. So a TUEC is an independent panel which should be composed of at least 3 sports physicians, and depending on the complexity of the application, a specialist in that medical area. For example, if it was an asthma TUE, the committee may contain a pulmonologist. The panel will review your application and will decide whether to grant it or deny it. They have 21 days to make this decision, and once the decision is reached, they will inform your anti-doping organization, so your TUE manager or administrator, who will in turn inform you whether it was granted or denied. So here you really see that your anti-doping organization acts as the facilitator between you and the Therapeutic Use Exemption Committee. So if the TUE is granted, I'm sure you'll be delighted, but however, if it is denied, your anti-doping organization must give you the reasons why it was denied and where you can appeal their decision. But often the TUEC may come back to you and just request further information. Perhaps you're missing one vital diagnostic test. So they'll often come back and explain to you, okay, we need X test and Y description, and then you can just reapply. So how do all these anti-doping organizations, do they all have the same process? How did the Therapeutic Use Exemption Committees decide if an application should be granted or not? Well, they followed the international standard for therapeutic use exemptions, which is essentially the rule book and guidebook, the Bible for all things TUE. And again, this can be found on the WADA website. So what are the key criteria for the grant of the TUE? How does that Therapeutic Use Exemption Committee decide by looking at your medical information if you should be granted or denied a TUE? Well, listed on this slide are the 4 conditions which are really the pillars on what the TUE process is built. All 4 must be fulfilled in order for a TUE to be granted. So the first, it is necessary to have a diagnosed medical condition. 2, it is unlikely that the treatment will improve your performance. 3, there is no reasonable permitted alternative. And finally, the requirement to use the substance or method is not due to prior use of the substance or method without a valid TUE. So generally, TUE should be applied for in advance before you use the prohibited substance or method. However, this is not always possible. We live in the real world, things happen in real time. And I'm sure some of you are probably asking yourself, but what happens if I get injured, if I get ill and I need medical treatment straight away and I don't have time to apply for and wait the 21 days or however long it takes for the ADO to give me the decision before using the medication? This is why we created the TUE, retroactive TUE criteria, and the 5 are listed on this slide. So in order to apply for a retroactive TUE, you must fulfill one of the criteria listed on this slide. They cover a wide range of scenarios, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I will not go into detail on each exemption, but I just would like to highlight E, as it is very relevant in the context of glucocorticoids. And E states that an athlete, you're allowed to apply for retroactive TUE if the athlete used the out of competition substance for therapeutic reasons, and that substance is only prohibited in competition. It's important also to note that meeting one of these retroactive conditions does not mean that you will automatically be granted a TUE, but rather that you are allowed to apply. It gets you to the next step. You still have to fulfill the criteria listed on the previous slide. So a few important points to remember here. All approved TUEs are valid for only for a specific medication and for a specific time. TUEs expire. So it's important to make a note of that. Put something in your calendar. If your TUE is expiring within a year, set a reminder in your calendar for 3 months before. Go visit your physician. Get them to update your medical information and reapply well in advance before your TUE expires. If we can go next slide, please. Yeah. And here we have a little warning. Permitted does not mean legal, and legal does not mean permitted in sport. This is especially prudent with some of the substances here, such as cannabinoids, narcotics, amphetamines. Just because you have a TUE for a substance, it's not a get out of jail free card. You can't present it at border crossings and expect to be able to carry medication everywhere. It permits you to use this substance and compete in sports. So this is an important point to remember. So on that note, let's do another poll question. Okay, this one is the first medical exemption was given at which Olympic Games? Was it in Calgary in 1988, London in 2012, Atlanta in 1996, or Paris in 2024? I'll give you a few seconds to get your answers in. I'd be very impressed with people getting this question correct. Okay, so the majority have gone for Atlanta in 1996. I'm happy that no one has picked Paris in 2024. Means you're awake. But the actual correct answer was Calgary in 1988. And as a follow-up poll question to this one, so what was this medical exemption granted for? So what was the first Olympic Games medical exemption granted for? Was it for alcohol to ease nerves, glucocorticoids for inflammatory bowel disease, insulin for diabetes, Adderall for ADHD? Okay, we see the answers coming in. Okay, and I see the majority have gone for insulin for diabetes. Some of you have even picked alcohol to ease the nerves. It must be having a tough evening or afternoon even. When the correct answer was actually glucocorticoids for inflammatory bowel disease, which is a very good segue into our next section. So the list changes in TUEs. Here, I will mainly be focusing on glucocorticoids. So next slide, please. Okay, as Mark has already mentioned, GCs are administered primarily for their potent anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive effects. They're readily available in various formulations and have been administered via different routes, such as local or systemic treatment. It's just a kind of a little note here. It's important to distinguish, even though people think as well steroids, they automatically think anabolic steroids. Even though they have a common steroidal structure, the glucocorticoid steroids display none of the physiological effects of anabolic steroids. So it's good to distinguish the two. And in fact, glucocorticoids are the class of substance for which we see the most TUEs every year. So I have some key points here to remember: that all injectable routes are prohibited in competition. All glucocorticoids by any route are not prohibited out of competition. Glucocorticoids excretion rates vary, and an in-competition sample may contain evidence of glucocorticoids even if it was used out of competition. So this is important in the context of what Mark was saying as he described the washout periods. Remember that something can stay in your system longer depending on which route you used it or what the substance was. And finally, TUE applications must provide appropriate clinical justification for glucocorticoid use. So then you have to work with your doctor on this, get them to clearly describe your medical condition. Just give as much information as possible, the reasoning why he or she is giving you the treatment. Make as complete a file as possible, and bring the checklist with you. Again, I'm emphasizing this: bring the checklist with you to see your physician. So here, this chart describes the 3 scenarios that may arise depending on whether the GC was administered in or out of competition, in or prior to the washout period. Each pathway provides guidance on when athletes should apply and when ADO should process the TUE applications. So let's take a look at it. So if we look at the far left column, if the TUE is used in, if the TUE is used in competition, or if the substance is used in competition, a TUE is absolutely necessary, and you should apply as soon as possible. Now, if we look at the column on the far right, if the TUE is used before the washout period, it is highly unlikely there will be a positive test, and therefore, usually you will not need a TUE. However, excretion rates can vary from person to person, so it's always good to err on the side of caution and prepare a medical file just in case. Finally, if we focus on the middle pathway, so you've used the substance out of competition, but within the washout period. As Mark described earlier, here now there is a real possibility that you would return a positive test in competition. Therefore, it's essential that you prepare the medical file with your physician. And I know sometimes you're not sure. Athletes will want assurance, and you want to know if you can apply in advance. Often, though, ADOs, they mightn't have the capacity to be able to give you the answer straight away. So it's important to remember that you can always apply retroactively in accordance with that retroactive clause 4.1e, which I mentioned earlier on. And some final key points on glucocorticoids and the washouts is to be aware that glucocorticoids within the washout period may result in a positive in-competition test. Triamcinolone, as Mark and Eric were speaking about earlier, has a particularly long washout period. Athletes always have the right to apply retroactively for a TUE under 4.1e. That's if the substance was used out of competition. Now I'll just highlight some resources on the WADA website available for athletes. As I've been kind of hammering home through this presentation, the checklists are available on the WADA website. They're based on documents we created called TUE Physician Guidelines, and they list the requirements for the medical evidence that must be submitted along with the application. Also, we have the EDEL platform, and this has improved greatly in the past few years. It's got a lot of e-learning courses for athletes, their guide to the goal, the prohibited list. We have now updated fact sheets on glucocorticoids, and these are all available in several languages. And I will pass you back to Mari. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much there, Davey. I particularly like all the fun facts that you threw into those poll questions. And like you, I'm glad that nobody chose a future Olympic Games for one of the answers there.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. And so thank you for the presentation there. We'll see you again in a few moments for the live Q&A. But at this stage now, we're going to welcome back Eric. Hi there, Eric. And now I think it would be great if you and I have a bit of a chat about all the different things that we've heard and learned there from both Mark and Davey, and talk about it from your perspective, from the athlete perspective. So first up, if I can start off by asking you about your experience with the doping control process. So firstly, how long were you a professional athlete for? And do you remember how many times you were tested?
Thank you, Marie. That's a very good question. So I was a professional footballer for 12 years, but in terms of the number of tests, I probably remember at least one a year, but there was other times where I had multiple tests in a year. So I can't actually remember the exact number, but there was enough that I'd run out of fingers.
And is there one that particularly sticks out, or maybe the first time, what was that like?
The first time was definitely nerve-wracking. I think it's always nerve-wracking going through the system, just knowing that anything in your body is your responsibility. So anytime there's a little bit of grey area around supplements and those type of things, I generally avoided that. But the amount of times you hear of tainted supplements and all these other things certainly makes the testing nervous. But yeah, with my first experience, I was actually, it was before I became a professional footballer. It was when I was still a teenager going through the junior ranks on the way up. I'd been selected for an Australian team. And part of that was we all got, at some stage throughout the year, we all got tested. So it was a learning experience, but one glad I got to experience and go through, because then it made each subsequent one a lot easier after that. So certainly knew my rights a lot better towards the end of my career as well. I think going in, I was a bit naive about all my rights and responsibilities.
Yeah, so and I imagine with such a long career that you had as well, that also comes with some injuries. And how did you deal with those, particularly from an anti-doping perspective?
Yeah, injuries certainly play a big part in everyone's career. My career was ended due to injuries. We tried many different things, including things which we had to import into the country because they weren't allowed to be used on humans at that stage. They were a veterinary drug. So that was part of that process, was going through the TUEs and then getting approval from the government to get it in the country. So it's amazing what you do as an athlete just to try and get up to play on the weekends. So yeah, dealing with that. And then there was a lot of, we're talking about the cortisone and those type of things. I experienced a lot of them throughout my career to just reduce inflammation in and around joints, because I had 13 or 14 surgeries. I can't remember in the end, but a lot of that was on joints, and we're trying to remove a lot of the swelling to enable me to keep playing.
So it sounds like you've had a lot of experience with TUEs. Could you tell our listeners the process you went through in terms of completing those or discussing it with your doctors?
Yeah, so I was probably lucky coming from a team sport and a very professional team sport in that we had a couple of doctors who really looked after the majority of the paperwork for that. We still had to sign it and make sure everything was still above board, but we had them doing the vast majority of the process for that. But for those who aren't lucky enough to have a doctor, then there's plenty of resource, or a specific team doctor or someone who knows the process. If you don't, then there's certainly a lot of resources out there that you can use to help you in that regard. And these webinars are a really good starting point for that, as well as the WADA website, ITA websites, Global Dro and all that are very good.
Yeah, I was going to touch upon that in terms of, I'm sure there are a lot of athletes listening who don't have access to a doctor who is familiar with the prohibited list. So in terms of them being able to understand what resources are out there, to be able to understand that they can take the prohibited list, they can maybe sit down with a physician and show them Global Dro, so that their physician can then begin to help them make informed decisions. But as always, it's always the principle of strict liability, and that the athlete is liable for what is found in their body, you know, irrespective of who might have prescribed it to them. Are there any other tips that you might want to share with those listening in terms of really doing your due diligence?
Yeah, I think other athletes are actually really good resources to use as well. So if you personally don't have a doctor who knows the prohibited list and how to do TUEs and those type of things, talk to your peers, because if you're going through that process, it's probably more likely that they're going to have been through the same process as well, and they may have a doctor who knows the process and helped them through it, and they may be able to, whether it's connecting the doctors or you speak directly to them, then they can certainly help out in that regard. So it's use the people around you, use the people you trust as well. But in the end, it really is, it's your responsibility to know it, because ultimately you're the one who gets punished if you stuff it all up.
Yeah. Now, obviously, people don't plan to have injuries. So I imagine that you also had experience of having to apply for a TUE retroactively as well.
Yeah, usually those were when something happens during a game, and the coaches insisted, and I insisted on going back out on the field, and that was often through an injection, both to play or needed to continue playing. So that meant the doctors then had to put in a retrospective TUE.
And did you think there were any differences in the process of applying for it retroactively, or very similar?
Very similar. I think the ability to do it retrospectively means you probably can get a little bit lazy in putting in the first one, but I think you've got to still make sure that what you're taking is really needed, and that the doctors are sure that you will pass the TUE or the pub test, I call it. Make sure it's clear and everything's above board.
Okay, and thinking ahead now, there's only a few weeks left of 2021. What would you advise athletes to do in terms of preparing themselves for the changes coming up in a few weeks?
I would read up on what the exact changes are and cross-reference that with any medication you are taking. Run it through any of the doctors, anyone who, if you're using nutritionists, those type of things. I would be really making sure, because we look at what happened to Maria Sharapova when it all changed. She was taking something, didn't realize it had gone onto the banned list, and so I'll probably check your junk mail folder as well, because that was her excuse for why that slipped through the cracks. So yeah, I'll just be making sure everything is hasn't been impacted by these new changes coming in.
Yeah, and Davey mentioned the resources that are available on the WADA website, including the Adele courses. And I know that there is a fact sheet on the changes. So if athletes don't have an Adele account, they can sign up for one and read some of the changes in athlete-friendly language as well, because it can be quite complex to navigate.
Yes, no, definitely. And as we've seen, and Mark navigated it very well, sometimes these words and drugs are very big, and some look very similar. So you might think you're okay, but it's actually not. A couple of letters here and there actually can make a big difference to that as well.
Yeah, thank you for all this, Eric. I can see that we've got quite a few of the live questions coming through now as well. So before I welcome everyone else back, just wondering if there's any final advice that you'd like to share, or any final experiences that you'd like to tell the athletes and coaches listening.
Once again, because it's your responsibility, what goes in is ultimately on you. If you have any doubts about it, then I think you're better off avoiding it, because you've got to. And a lot of the time with supplements, if you don't know why you're taking it or what the benefits are, then you probably shouldn't be taking it anyway. So I'll just say, if you have any queries, questions, you're better off avoiding it, taking the risk and the doubt out of it.
Great, thank you very much for sharing your sort of testimonial stories as well there, and for all the advice. So I think if I can ask Mark and Davey to come back now, and we'll take a look at some of the live questions, and we'll tackle these in the order that they come. And I can see already that people are being pretty kind to me. They're not asking me to pronounce too many complicated medical substances at the moment. The first one is for you, Mark, and that is, can you explain what the new category SO is?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Giovanna. So the category S0 is non-approved substances. This category has actually been on the prohibited list for as long as I can remember, for many years. This is the first year that there's actually been a concrete example of this, and that is, as I mentioned, BPC 157. Now, this category really addresses, it's meant for drugs that are actually not approved for human use. And when I say not approved, that means they're not actually, they don't have a license, they haven't been through the clinical trials, they're not, they haven't been approved by governments and health organizations that they're fit for human medical use. Some of the things that fall into this category are things like drugs that are still undergoing that clinical trials. Sometimes things are discontinued, so they're no longer recommended for humans. They may fall into this category at that point. Some of the designer drugs, which again were not meant for human use, they're not medical drugs. And some of the veterinary drugs, which are only meant for animal use, they can also fall into this category. So it's, in essence, it's anything that doesn't have an approved license for human use generally can fall into this S0 category.
Thanks for that, Mark. And the next one here is for you as well. And this is a very specific question. It's, what about glucocorticoids in eye drops?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Jennifer. So glucocorticoids, when used in eye drops, are actually considered a topical use of glucocorticoids because they're going onto the surface of the eye. Now, topical use of glucocorticoids is permitted. You don't need a TUE for that. And I know that there's another question there actually around, I think from Ephraim, similar question really. It was around the applications of creams onto the skin in competition. Now, the same reason as I just mentioned for eye drops, this also applies to things put onto the skin and that's also considered as a topical use. That's not prohibited.
Great, thank you for answering both of those there. Next one is from Mike Cook, and I think I will direct this one to Davey. And their question is, under what circumstances would a TUE be allowed for in-competition use of an intra-articular injection of glucocorticoid?
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, these are kind of questions we get all the time. But as I say, with all TUE applications, everything is done on a case-by-case basis. Every TUE will be, it's evaluated by the 3 physicians. They take in every case on its own merits, and every case has to fulfill these 4.2 conditions, the ones I listed out in the slide. So what would be the conditions that you would allow this? What was the treatment justified? Describe the whole process that you went through to make the diagnosis. Give the TUEC all the information possible. Explain to them. The TUEC has to make the diagnosis themselves. So the more you put down and explain why the treatment was necessary for the athlete, the more likely that you will get the TUE and you will fulfill them 4.2 conditions. that's not much more I can say about that, because it's very specific and every case by case has to be looked at on its own.
Thank you for that. I am just trying to scroll up to make sure I've got the next question here. Yes, and I think this is another question for you here, please, Davey. The question here is, if an athlete has already started treatment, for example, with insulin, but has not been tested yet, and they now want to apply for a TUE, should they apply for a retroactive TUE?
Okay, so with this question, it's when we often see this with insulin that treat diabetes, because often people are they're diagnosed with diabetes quite young, and you don't at 8 years old you're not classified as an athlete and come under anti-doping rules, and if you are, you'd be some sort of prodigy. But so that there's kind of common sense, and there's kind of like you have to be a bit, you know, understanding as well in these kind of cases. There's a certain point where you become a national level athlete or an international level athlete, and that's when you become underneath the ADO rules. So that's when you need to apply for the TUE. The way to find out this is always to contact your national anti-doping organization. Sometimes, depending on the sport, you may not have to reply in advance. They might say you're competing in Gaelic football, but for us, we don't prioritize Gaelic football, so you can always apply retroactively. Every ADO will have its own rules in place. So the best thing to do is contact your anti-doping organization, your national anti-doping organization, see what framework they have in place, let them guide you. For things like insulin, there you have to understand as well that people have been on it for a long time, so automatically you're not going to be applying retroactively. You can start the TUE from the point that you have applied from once you become under the ADO rules.
Great, thank you. Next one is for Mark. And the question is, are there any changes or dosage limitations on other examples? For example, asthma medication, like inhaled salmeterol or formoterol. I'm going to guess this last one, fluticasone or similar mixtures. So maybe first up, Mark, how was the pronunciation? Pretty bad.
No, you got it right, actually. Thanks, Jeffrey, for that question. I think no, the only change for 2022 is around salbutamol. So the dose limitations for motorol, salmeterol, and fluticasone, there hasn't been any other changes for any other drugs. It's just the salbutamol one that has changed.
Great, thank you. We've had lots of medications questions. And the final one for the moment anyhow is the new dosage limitation of salbutamol 600 mcg over 8 hours in addition to the limitation of 2017 or in place of it?
It's in place of. In place of. So in 2017, it used to be, or even now, it used to be 800 micrograms over 12 hours. So the change for 2022 is 600 micrograms. Sorry. The change for 2022 is 600 micrograms over 8 hours, starting from any dose.
Perfect, thanks. I'm now just quickly switching to the chat because I see that someone put a question in there a few moments ago. So it's another glucocorticoids question, Mark. So I'll stick with you for this one, if that's okay. And that is, can you tell us about the glucocorticoids cream, prednisolone, Gentalin beta? For instance, can I use the cream in competition period in the next year?
If it's a cream, if it's being used on the skin, that is considered a topical use, and topical use is permitted. So you can actually use that in competition.
Okay, and maybe we have time for one more, and that is another medications one. It is, why do you think there are drugs like Activegan that are using in some countries in an unsafe manner but are not banned right now?
So for a drug to go onto the prohibited list, it needs to fulfill 2 of those 3 criteria. So it needs to either show that there's some performance enhancement or potential for performance enhancement, some harms to health, and against the spirit of sport. So, any drug is judged basically on those three criteria. And I think active vegan, if it was to be considered, it would need to be measured against those three criteria.
Great. Thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get through the last couple of questions. But if you do still have an outstanding question that you would like answered, please do send us an email, and we're going to pop up our email address for you there. Right now it is education@ita.sport. So please do drop us a line and we'd be happy to help. Okay, so that's nearly the end of today's webinar. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists, Davey, Mark, and Eric, for their time, their expertise, and their insights. And of course, a big thanks to you, our audience, for your participation in the polls and for all those questions at the end. Now, after the webinar ends, you will receive a link to a survey along with the presentation slides. The survey is very short. It will just take you a couple of minutes to fill in, but we would love to have your feedback. Also, importantly, we're beginning to plan the webinar program for 2022. So please use this survey to tell us the topics that you would most like us to cover next year. And our last webinar for the year is taking place on the 16th of December, and that is going to have a Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games focus. So for any of you heading off to the games, please do join in, let your teammates know that they'll hear some important games specific information during this webinar. And the QR code is on your screens now, and you can register for this straight away. So that just leaves me the time to say thanks again to all of you, to our panelists and our listeners. Have a great rest of the day or good evening to you all. Thanks very much.